Welcome back to the Discourse Program channel here on YouTube. This is Reinhard Neder, and this is the second of the clips in the series on nanoparticles. In this second clip, I want to take you to expand the simple shape that we started in the last clip to make more complicated nanoparticles, nanoparticles of automatically controlled arbitrary size. So let's quickly review what was done in the first clip. In the first clip, we started here this macro called nano.mac, and in this clip we have to first go to the discourse section from the suite. Then in the next section here we read a unit cell by going into the read menu and then use the cell command to expand the sodium chloride unit cell file into a block of 3 by 3 by 3 unit cells. Let's quickly check the unit cell file. The unit cell file itself in the discourse structure that I use is simple ASCII text file. So the first line, title, that's mandatory. That's the only part that's really mandatory. Gives you a title, for example, sodium chloride, and the space group here, FM3barm. The unit cell parameters A, B, C, alpha, beta, gamma. Please note that all 6 parameters have to be given despite the fact that we're in a cubic structure. And then after the atoms keyword, we have 2 lines, one for the sodium atom at 0, 0, 0, and one for the chlorine atom at 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, with here in the last column the 2 thermal parameters, the atomic displacement parameters. This file format has the advantage that I can add additional information that's not part of the CIF files. So with that, let's get back to the macro here. Afterwards, we do a quick show atom all, listing all the atoms on the screen so we can see where these atoms are. But just right now, mostly then we do go with a plot menu into the plotting part of the discourse program, where we choose here the program JMOL to have an interactive plot. We select all atom types, meaning we select both sodium and chlorine atom types. The extent is set to all, meaning we use the whole crystal, not just a small volume that is limited in space. We will create this CIF file called sodium chloride NaCl_plot.cif. And as a matter of habit, I usually add an underscore plot to the output file just to make sure that I do not accidentally overwrite a CIF file on the screen. And with the run command with its optional parameter plot::enter, we will then start the plot. And this whole thing was started here in the folder Discourse Workshop Nanoparticle. That's where all these files are. Note what I've done, and that's probably a good idea to do right now. I've made a backup of the current state of the macro here into this file called nano_01.mac. So that's identical to the present macro in order to have a little backup if you want to expand this. And I invite you to do the same so that as these videos progress and the macro becomes longer, you can always go back and look at the individual states that we were at beforehand. So in the discourse program, we will need to go to this folder. So let's copy here the path to the folder with a Control-C once we've turned this up here in blue. In the discourse program, keep in mind you need to do CD, and since it's a Unix program, you need to then type here Control-Shift and then V to copy this into the program. Now we're in the right folder, and we can start the macro with the command and then followed by the name of the macro, nano.mac. And when I enter, return, we will then go through all these commands. And see, now we're starting the JMOL program. Here is the program. Let me change the display here in the display from atoms to 150% van der Waals atoms. And now we have our initial cube of 3 by 3 by 3 unit cells in there. All right, so the next thing is I want to now start is expand the macro to make the crystal larger, to make it in different shapes. And before we do that, what we can do here is interactively go into the Disqus program. So type Disqus, and then we check here. There is a command called help surface. And with the help surface command, we will get information on the surface command. And as you notice, that is short, since the surface command is simply a menu to define crystal surfaces and the related settings. The interesting command in there is predominantly here this boundary. So if you type here now boundary, you see we have quite a few of different boundaries that we could apply. Simplest thing would be in boundary HKL, followed by the Miller indices HKL, the distance to the center of the crystal, the distance of the lattice plane to the point 000 in the crystal. Alternatively, instead of just cutting a single HKL plane, you can do an HKL form, so to combine all symmetrically equivalent HKL faces into one combined form to make, for example, a pentagon dodecahedron or other complicated shapes depending on the crystal system. For the cubic system, there's also a special form called here under the form entry cube octahedron, which will make an ideal cube octahedron consisting of the cube faces 100 and the octahedron faces 111, such that all the octahedral faces touch at the corners. Then we will do, and that's what we'll start with, is a sphere. Notice it takes as parameter here the radius of the sphere. Later on we can expand that to make an ellipsoidal particle, where I changed the concept to not give the radius along the 3 half-axes, but instead the diameters along the half-axis. It's a bit of a break in the logic, yes, I know. Let's just keep that in mind. Another shape we might use is the cylinder, where you can define here a radius of the cylinder and then the half height of the cylinder, half its length. But with these help commands, you can always look up what kind of parameters do we need for that, what optional parameters are there. Right now we'll ignore them. We'll get to these optional parameters later on to see more. Down here, notice it says press return for next page. So if you press a return or enter, we get more detailed information now on the different shapes, like here HKL, defining that the surface is defined as a plane through the Miller indices HKL, and so on and so on and so on. All this. And once I'm at the back of the menu here, the help menu tells me I'm currently at the help level, Disqus surface, so in the surface menu. And if I type a simple empty enter / return, I leave the help menu in there. Now, since the macro goes here first to the Disqus level, what we need to make sure that is here in the Disqus in the interactive session, we do an exit to go back to the suite level so that our macro will run just fine. All right, first thing we want to do is a modification. Let's make the crystal a little bigger so we have more space for different sizes. Let's just right now use 10 by 10 by 10 unit cells. And now this will be very many atoms. So what I will do is here, I will add a comment in front of the show command. That way it's not applied at all. And after the show command, what we now need to do is enter into the surface menu. So the command would be surface. And let's not forget the corresponding exit to go back to the Disqus menu. And in the surface menu, again, as a reminder, the indentations are not critical. You don't have to type them. Makes it easier to read if you indented maybe a space or two. We now want to do a boundary. And let's use a spherical boundary, so sphere. And now the radius of this sphere. Let's just say right now we use a sphere of 20.0 angstroms. That's all we need. And We will run this as is right now. Let's not forget to save this here. And then make sure we're here at the suite prompt. So if I rerun this macro now, nano.mac, I could use this previous command by just using the arrow keys on your keyboard to go through the command history. If you now type that, a new version of the JMOL shows up. You see our crystal is now bigger, but strangely it is black or grayish. And if I now rotate the crystal, every once in a while you may see inside this sphere there, depending on the tilt that I use. And the reason for that is, if I go back here to the Discus program, let me show the last atoms, or the first 10, doesn't really matter. Show atom, comma, 1, comma, let's say 10. I'll show the first 10 atoms. And notice these atoms are now atoms called void. If you look at the coordinates, they're exactly perfectly at the coordinates where all the chlorine, sodium atoms used to be. And the idea behind that is if you run a command in Discus, like the boundary command here, or there's also a command, a remove command to remove individual atoms, the consequence is that the atoms that you remove, here the ones outside the spherical surface, are initially turned just into voids. They're not really physically removed from the memory of the computer, so that keeps the sequence of atoms unchanged. And this has many advantages on a speedy calculation if you want to change, modify the chemistry of the structure and things like that. Right now, they are a bit of a nuisance, of course, all these voids, since we really wanted to see our little sphere inside this object here. And we have two choices. The obvious choice would be, or let me go to the less obvious first. We could, in the plot program, say select all, and then deselect the void. So you could type here, deselect void, since these atoms are called void, and that means the void atoms will not be plotted on the screen. Let me save this macro. Back to the Discus suite level and run the macro again. And now this looks better. See if I make it a little smaller, rotate around. We now have here our first spherical nanoparticle. If I show the atoms again at 100% van der Waals radius, notice if you carefully look, this is not a sphere, but it's a polygon consisting of many different surfaces on this crystal. Up here you have a miniature 001 phase, and then these tilted faces with varying complex indices. Here there's a little octahedral phase. That, of course, is a direct consequence of the fact that we have underlying the structure a three-dimensional lattice and discrete atoms that we model. And from that, if you cut a spherical surface, you either cut out an atom or you don't cut out an atom, and thus at the end the surface of such a nanoparticle, especially a very small nanoparticle, will not be a perfect sphere, but rather a polygon of many different faces. Something else to notice is that we have now here, actually, if I click on this, several instances of JMOL active at the same time. And if we were to rerun the macro many times over, these would eventually clog our memory or just get all in the way. So what we can do instead is, here is another optional parameter and the run command, where we can say kill : yes, and that means we do kill, we stop all the previous JMOL instances, so that at the end we only have the current active JMOL program active. All right, now if I go back here to the Discus program, if I analyze the structure, and we can put that in the macro in a second as well, a convenient way to analyze it is to go into the chemistry menu And in the chemistry menu, there's a command called element that gives you the elemental composition of this structure. And you see we have an initial crystal of 10 by 10 by 10 unit cells with a total number of 8,000 atoms. The 8 different atoms in the unit cell, sodium and chloride, 2 different atom types. And if you look, we now have some 750 or so sodium and chlorine atoms, but 6,500 roughly void atoms on the outside of our little sphere. And we carry these around. They are useful as long as you want to do quick manipulation. Right now, let me show you a way to get rid of them. And that would be after this exit of the surface. We now do a purge, add an inline comment, so that we tell you that we've actually, with a purge command, removed all voids from the crystal. And with that, if we save this macro again, we need to make sure here that we go back to the suite level, exit, exit. Now we're at the suite level. Be careful not to type one more exit, then we would leave the program. And we can run the macro again at nano.mac. Now notice here the JMOS disappeared in between. Other than that, we here see the same structure as before. Nothing changed. All right, looks good. Now let me change here, for the fun of it, the radius a little bit. Let's go to 30 angstroms. Save this. And run the macro again. All right, looks good. Let me change the atoms to 100% van der Waals atoms. And now notice something unexpected, strange happens. This is no longer a sphere, but a truncated sphere. We still have here 100 faces on the structure. The fact that we have here fairly large terraces of the 111 faces, that's due to the cutting of this roughly spherical surface here, cutting through the atoms in there. But the fact that we have these large terraces of the 100 surfaces, that is actually not what we want. Let me show you what happens if I go here to 35 angstroms radius. Run the macro again. And you notice now the structure has become worse. It's almost a cube here. We have very little 111 terraces on the side, little edges that are cut here. And the reason for that is simply that our initial crystal consisted of 10 by 10 by 10 unit cells with a sodium lattice parameter of 5.64 angstroms. That means our crystal of 10 unit cell sizes has a diameter of 56 angstroms. And if we then cut a sphere of radius 35 angstroms, that means we will now cut here the crystal at a surface that is larger than our initial object. In order to correct that, what we need to do is make our initial object bigger. One way would be to simply say, okay, we replace these 1/10 by, let's say, 200 by 200 by 200 unit cells and hope that our largest nanoparticle that we ever want to build is not bigger than that. But the ideal way is really to build a crystal that will expand initially to a size large enough for a spherical object to fit into it, independent of the size that we make it. So with that, what we need to do is, before we build the initial object, we need to read with the cell command the sodium chloride structure. And here it's enough to read just one unit cell. Now after this state, once discus has started and we've read one unit cell of sodium chloride, now the discus program knows the lattice parameters, and it can now use these lattice parameters to build a crystal that we can expand to a suitable size. Here, what we need to do is really, we can say the number of unit cells, and this will be a variable that we will introduce in a second, should be the intended diameter. So let's use our diameter here, and we don't want to use a fixed number here. Let's say, for example, we can use here $1 as a parameter that we give to the macro that we run to shape its size. And we need to divide now this diameter. This is here right now intended to be the diameter by the lattice parameter number 1. Lattice in square brackets 1 is the A lattice parameter. But careful, if you divide the intended diameter $1 by the lattice parameter, and we want to use a integer number, so we need to cut it down with the int command to the next smallest integer number. This may at the edges of the crystal be ever so slightly a little bit too small, so we need to add a safety margin of 2 more unit cells, one on the left side, one on the right hand side, so that our final surface that we will build will actually fit through this crystal. All right, now end cell will be a variable. We need to define that at some point in the program. It's not really important where we do that. I like to do that, all these kind of administrative job at the beginning of the macro. So let's just say here the command variable integer comma end cell, and with that we have now defined a integer variable, so I can only hold whole numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., as many unit cells as we need. And this receives a value here calculated as the intended diameter divided by the current A lattice parameter, and then 2 as a safety margin to make sure that it all fits. Let me add here right away another variable, now a real valued variable called p underscore diameter. Oops, that should be an underscore. It's not important that this variable is called capital P underscore diameter. It's just confusing maybe here. Let's just call it diameter, full name to it. You can abbreviate your variables as ever you like to readability. And then it is a good idea to say here diameter is equal to $1. So here we copy the user input, the parameter that we transfer to the macro, into the variable called diameter, so that we can then operate at several instances with this one variable in there. And that of course means here I need to change this to diameter. And keep in mind, here I now need to change the number of unit cells to read not of course 10, but now this needs to be replaced by end cell, same here for the x coordinate, and finally for the number of unit cells along the z-axis. So we will still make a cubic shaped initial object, but now we determine the number of unit cells that we need along the x, y, and z direction by the diameter of our object. Divide the diameter by our lattice parameter 1. Here that is enough since it's a cubic structure, so lattice 1, lattice 2, lattice 3 are all identical. And then by adding the safety margin of 2, we have enough unit cells to do that. Last modification we need to do is here this 35. Let's quickly forgotten such a change. We now need to change to the diameter, but keep in mind the parameter to the boundary sphere command is the radius, not the diameter. So we need to divide the diameter here by 2 to get the radius into our sphere. That should do it. And we quickly review it. So we do here 2 variables. an integer valued variable called n cell, the number of unit cells, a real valued variable called diameter, the diameter of our nanoparticle. We give it a proper value, and then read the unit cell once so that the discus program is aware, knows the lattice parameters A, B, and C. And then we can use that information to divide the diameter by the lattice parameter, cut it down to the next integer number, add 2 unit cells for safety margin. And now we can expand our crystal to a block of n cell by n cell by n cell unit cells, which will automatically be adjusted depending on the size of the crystal. If you make a tiny nanoparticle, we don't really read that many unit cells. And to illustrate that, let me add here after the plot the chemistry menu, element, and exit back to the discus level. Save this, and that way we will see here at the bottom of our screen, once we run the macro, how large the crystal initially was, how many atoms it does consist of now. Make sure we have saved it. If I run this macro now, of course, I get an error message since I typed the macro initially without parameters. And here in the macro, we have in the beginning used the string $1 as the user supplied parameter, which will then be transferred. It's the value of $1 into the variable diameter. So the command here tells you that we have not supplied enough macro parameters. This error occurred in the line number 9 of our first top level macro. So what we need to do is now give a diameter, let's say 20 angstroms. It's not important that we give this here as a decimal number. All right, diameter, I see, okay. Yes, instead of spelling here diameter with an E at this point, I have spelled the variable with a typing error. So you see here, there we need to, of course, change it to diameter. Let me check that it's spelled properly here. Yes, and there. And similar here. So now we have spelled it all correctly, hopefully. Okay, now we get this tiny object of just 20 angstroms diameter in there. It only consisted initially of 5 by 5 unit cells. Has roughly here 90 and 90 atoms of each type. If you make it a little bigger, the diameter now to 40 angstroms or so. We get, of course, a larger object here. There you go, and see, this looks nicely spherical. You still have little facets like here, the section of the 111 phase. But if you increase the size even more, let's say, why not go to 100 angstroms? We then end up here with a sizable object that you see it's already a reasonably smooth spherical surface, except we still have little terraces here on the top of the 100 faces that cannot be avoided. But this is now a nice spherical nanoparticle. The fact that you have here the 111 terraces or here the 100 terraces, similarly in between here other faces, that just simply cannot be avoided. And to make sure here, let's go to really big size, 200 angstroms. All right. And now this looks like a nice spherical object here with small terraces on there for the various sizes in there. Notice that took initially 37 by 37 by 37 atoms, and at the moment we have 186,000 atoms in our crystal, pretty much half and half sodium and chlorine atoms in there. The slight discrepancy is due to the fact that we cut the surface around the point 000, and that's a point occupied by sodium rather than by chlorine. So if you wanted to have exactly identical number of atoms in the structure, you would have to find a space symmetrically between sodium and chlorine atoms in order then to cut the sphere around that. So this is the way to build a nanoparticle of flexible size. The main idea behind that is you read this structure once to know the lattice parameters, and then you use these lattice parameters to calculate the number of unit cells that we need along the x, y, and z direction. You expand the crystal accordingly, and then we can shape it here with a spherical boundary, for example, and plot the structure. Let's not forget the purge command, which will then remove all the non-void atoms, all the void atoms from outside our surface that we intend to use. All right, let me quickly illustrate what happens if we go here to this point and copy this and say boundary form, comma, and let's use here, for example, the 1, 2, 3 lattice plane, also a diameter divided by 2.0, so it gives you roughly the same size of the object. But now we use here the lattice planes 1, 2, 3 as a defining shape. We will add a comment here in front of the boundary sphere command so that we don't get the sphere. Then the form afterwards. And now the crystal will still look a bit spherical, but if you carefully notice, it now consists here all of these 1, 2, 3 terraces of these rather low symmetry faces in there. And interesting. Yeah. Yes. Notice this crystal that I built is not large enough. We're building a cube here that is not big enough. We need to make it a bit bigger in order for these faces to really extend into the corners of the cube. To illustrate that, let me quickly illustrate what happens there. If I quickly do a drawing here, all right, what we built is we have here our coordinate system, and now I built an initial size of the crystal on the assumption of making a spherical object. So the idea was we would cut the crystal here at these points, and that's where I calculated the object. But instead, our current crystal actually consists of HKL planes, and these HKL planes happen to be here. Let's keep it there. These HKL planes are now more of a shape like these. And so on. And the distance of these planes along the a-axis varies from that from a cube. So you need to keep in mind, if you build a more complex object, that you may have to add to the size of the crystal. Another similar situation that might occur is if you build, for example, an hexagonal crystal. And if you now build a spherical object in there, even if you build such an object, keep in mind if you use the diameter along the a-axis, you will end up making the number of unit cells up to this spot here, while you really need to go in the number of unit cells all the way out to the intersection here on the bottom left, since in the hexagonal space, the diameter of the sphere, here the radius of the sphere, along the normal to the b-axis is further out than the intersection of the radius here with the direct a-axis. So that's always something to keep in mind when you build an object with various shapes, that you may have to think about how large do I need to make this crystal for it to really completely describe the structure that I want to. So we need to do here the crystal a little bigger. What you have to do is calculate then the intersection of the 1, 2, 3 faces with the a-axis and see if the crystal face itself has a diameter to the origin of the unit cell, where does it intersect the a, b, and c axis? What is the furthest point along the axis? That will be the index number 1, h index, and from that we can calculate the proper size in there. All right, let me copy this nano macro and save it now in a different name. Maybe change it to make a cylinder rather than that, or right now we can actually leave it here. If we change this here to bound boundary cylinder, and now we use here diameter divided by 2, comma, length divided by 2. We need two parameters, the diameter and the length of the cylinder. So we go here, add a comment to this 1, 2, 3 face. And so we need here a second parameter now, variable real, comma, length. And what we'll actually need is we need to copy this. We need not only unit cell sizes along the x-axis, but we need now at least 2. We'll make it complete and use different unit cell sizes along the x, y, and z axis. Since the cylinder, of course, might have a different length compared to the diameter. And in the Discus program, when you build a cylinder, at the moment, its main axis is always parallel to the 0, 0, 1 axis. Look for a next update. I'll add something to that to make the cylinder point into an arbitrary direction. But for right now, we just use that. And that means the x diameter will be the diameter. Likewise here, the y diameter will also be the one, while the c diameter will be half the length, and that we now divide by lattice parameter 3, up here by lattice parameter 2. Just to make it a little easier, I align them vertically. Technically speaking, that's not important. So you see, we now expand the crystal to diameter divided by lattice 1, diameter by lattice 2, unit cells along the x, respectively the y direction, and the number of unit cells along the c direction we calculate from the intended length of our cylinder. And since that will be parallel to the c-axis, we use lattice parameter 3 for that. Here in this cubic structure, of course, lattice 1, lattice 2, lattice 3 all have the same value, and it doesn't really matter which one we use. And now we need to modify this to say here x, y, and c in order to expand that. And then we can do a cylindrical object with diameter around the AB plane and a length along the c-axis The rest will stay the same. Let me save this. We need one more thing, of course. I never gave length a value, so we now need to go here to the diameter and say length equal $2, not $1, $2. So we now need two parameters for this macro. The first one for the length of the macro, the first one for the diameter, and the second one for the length of this cylinder axis. Save it again, and now we provide two parameters. Let's make a fairly narrow cylinder for right now, so we say a diameter of 40 angstroms and a length of, let's say, 150 angstroms, so to make it really obvious. And you see, now we're looking at the top view in JMOL as a standard. When you started, we're looking along the z-axis. We have here this reasonably cylindrical diameter of our cylindrical object. So it's a circular thing, but if we tilt it now, it makes a nice cylindrical object here that we have shaped. And from now, you can add further things to it. We could add here a tip of other surfaces, make a pyramidal 111 edge to the top of this cylinder or something like that by calculating at what distance would a nice 111 face intersect our cylinder axis here. Or right now we could just simply invert the sizes. Let's make it 150 in the AB plane and 40 angstroms in length, so we'll get a small flat plate-like object. Okay, again, a very nice circular circumference here. And now, if I tilt this, this will be a disc-shaped object of a cylindrical shape in there. All right, let me try on the fly a little modification to this. If you go back to the Discus program, if I go to the Surface menu and type Help here, if I go to the boundary, notice I have not talked about this parameter inside, outside. And that lets you decide which atoms to keep, those on the inside of the surface or those atoms on the outside of the surface. And that allows you to build also odd shapes, indented shapes and things like that, which I first want to demonstrate here on the fly in this macro. So what we'll do is now we will build this cylinder with diameter 2, length 2, and now we will add here a boundary sphere, comma, diameter divided by 4, so we use half the diameter compared to the other objects, and this is again the radius. And now we will do two more things. I have to place this at cent z, comma, and this we place here. That's the optional command, cent z, that defines where we want to place the center of this sphere. And the center of the sphere I would like to place here on the top of this object. So that would be a position in fractional coordinates here, half the length of the diameter above my plane 0, 0, 0. So this would be the length divided by 2. That's in angstroms right now, the position, and I need to divide that by the lattice parameter 3. And now I keep the atoms on the outside of this sphere. So that means the idea is we want to make here a small spherical surface on the top of my cylindrical plate for this plate-like object. And we cut out here a sphere where we keep the atoms on the inside of the sphere. And if everything works fine, we should now have like a bowl-shaped object where we have here an indentation in this thing. So let's get back to the main menu, start the macro. Oh yeah, we need of course two parameters, 150, 40 angstroms. I did not provide another parameter for this extra sphere in there. All right, optional param. Did I mistype that? Should be send Z. Oh yeah, there's a comma missing here. Sometimes those errors are a little tricky to find. You see we have here the parameter of the boundary command, sphere, comma, then the diameter, and I'm missing here the comma to distinguish the next optional parameter, send Z, from all the other parameters. Then we need here again a comma. That's a strict rule in Disqus that all the parameters, optional parameters, required parameters have to be separated by a comma, and we keep that in there. So let's try this again. Looks better. Okay, this is a bit smaller than I expected. Oh yeah, there we have this little indentation. Let me check the radii. Oh yes, I wanted to do 150 angstroms here in the AB plane. Other than that, it worked just fine. Good. And you notice something is different here. In the top plane of our plate-like cylindrical object, we now have here a sphere that goes into the bottom here of this top plate, cutting down there with a radius half the radius of the main cylinder axis, where we have now an indented object into that. And this could be used, for example, to build porous materials, to make pores into such a nanoparticle object. Yeah, so you see, with the boundary command, you can do a lot of different types of objects. What you should do is, in the program, go to Disqus, go to the surface menu, enter the help menu, and then predominantly look here at the boundary command to see how do these boundaries, the different boundaries, apply the different shapes that the Disqus program currently offers, what parameters do they take, and then these optional parameters here, for example, the send X, Y, Z, defining where is the center of this object that you want to cut the surface, and if you want to keep the atoms on the inside or the outside. Notice the old style would be just the words inside or outside. The proper modern way in Disqus would actually say here to say keep and then a colon, since it's an optional parameter. This is the name of the optional parameter, followed here by the outside name, their value, saying that we want to keep the atoms on the outside of this surface. If I do that, nothing will change. The program recognizes both the old thing for backwards compatibility, but also for the new one. If we change here the position, for example, we could just shift this slightly off center. So we could add here send X colon diameter divided by, let's say, 1/8 or so. just to make it a little off-center. And now we use the same parameters. Again, oh yeah, again, same typing error, diameter instead of diameter. Yeah. Save this here and run it. Okay. Oh yeah. I must have cut it too far off. Yes, here. There's the sphere. It's been cut off too far outside. Let's send x diameter 8. So let's use it only a 16th of the surface. Okay, see, now we've cut this object here into the edge of this object, and you could add now more than one of these indentations into your crystal if you wanted to make it of any kind of complex shape. Yeah. All right, with that, let me finish the macro here. We'll continue this to make different objects, different sizes, and point these sizes into different directions. But right now, there should be enough to guide you to building nanoparticles with somewhat of a variety of shapes in there. I decide not to edit this macro. So all the typing errors that are built in, they're not built in on purpose, but they serve actually as a reminder. If you have a typing error in a macro, don't be afraid. Use the error message that the Discus program provides in order to analyze what happened. How can I correct this? What can I do? Let me go back here now to the end, to the macro. The essential parts that we now have at the current is we have three different variables, n cell x, y, z, two different diameter parameters, the diameter and the length, to which we assign values here. $1 and $2 are the parameters that we use on the macro. Notice here the first parameter, a comma, second macro parameter. And then we use the unit cell that we read once to determine how many unit cells do we need along the x, y, and z directions. And finally, we then expand the crystal here to sodium chloride cell, to n cell x, y, z unit cells, so that it always has the proper size, even if you change the diameters. And here I've illustrated different shapes that we can cut: a sphere, a form that is the sum of all Miller indices 1, 2, 3 here as an example, with a little trick that we need to adjust the size of the crystal. It was actually not big enough, the crystal here. A cylinder by itself, and now a cylinder with an indented sphere. And the reason why this indented sphere is further out than I expected is really an error in the little macro, since I'm dividing here the diameter divided by 16. Diameter is now a value in angstroms divided by 16, so it's still a parameter in 16. But the coordinates need to be given in fractional coordinates, so I should really divide it here by lattice of 1, the a lattice parameters, to get to fractional coordinates. And in order then for it to move a little bit, let me go back here to half the diameter. Yeah, that should be placing it at the edge. If we do it on final run for the macro, we now get here again our object. There, see, the crystal is now nicely cut off here a little bit at the edge of this whole object. And we can be flexibly positioning this indented to any place where we want to. The plot menu is not changed compared to the previous one, except for the additional kill:yes command, which removes previous instances of JMO, so we don't have too many of those windows open. Here I've illustrated the use of these optional parameters for the centering along the X, Z direction, whether we want to keep atoms on the inside or outside. Default is to keep all the atoms on the inside. The chemistry menu I've not illustrated too much, but it allows you to see how large is the crystal initially that you read, how many atoms do you have in there, how many different atom types, and the absolute number of each atom type in this structure. With that, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to you joining me for this next session, where we will then go a little more into complex shapes of these nanoparticles, and then eventually modify these, build on the surface, change the interior structure, and modify them, and maybe at some point or other soon calculate a powder diffraction pattern. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to seeing you here again on the YouTube channel in the near future.